There is a city in Europe that was supposed to represent the future. Not some rusting post-industrial relic, not a forgotten town in a fading hinterland, but Paris, London, Berlin, Amsterdam. The names that every generation for 100 years was told meant something. The names on the postcards, the names in the movies, the cities that, if you made it there, meant you had made it. And right now, millions of people who made it there are quietly packing up and leaving, not fleeing war, not chasing a dream, leaving because the dream, they have decided, is already over. This is the story nobody in those cities wants to admit out loud. The story that real estate agents do not put in their brochures, that tourism boards do not mention in their campaigns, that mayors and urban planners deflect with talk of regeneration schemes and infrastructure investment. But the data is unambiguous, and the pattern, once you see it, cannot be unseen. Europe's greatest cities are entering a phase of quiet exit. A slow, dignified, and entirely predictable escape. And the people leaving are not the desperate or the dispossessed. They are the educated, the ambitious, and the capable. The very people these cities were built to attract. If you have ever wondered why the streets of central Paris feel different now than they did 15 years ago, why the phrase, "London used to be," has become a sentence you hear at dinner parties with increasing frequency, or why something feels genuinely off about the cities that once seemed invincible, you are not imagining it. And we are going to show you exactly what is happening, city by city, pattern by pattern, before the rest of the world catches up. If you want to watch this kind of decline documented before the mainstream narrative catches on, subscribe. Empire Falls covers what the official story refuses to acknowledge. Let us begin not with a statistic, but with a feeling. The feeling every long-term resident of a major European city knows. The feeling that the thing you came for, whatever it was, has shifted. The energy you once felt walking off a train at Gare du Nord, arriving in Shoreditch for the first time, stepping out at Alexanderplatz on a crisp autumn morning, that feeling has not disappeared entirely, but it has changed pitch. It is quieter now, more careful. And beneath the cafes still full and the tourist photographs still being taken, something structural is fracturing. That fracture begins with numbers. But not the numbers that get reported. Not GDP growth, or tourism arrivals, or headline inflation. The number that matters is a quieter one. Net migration out of these cities. How many people are deciding that the calculation no longer adds up? That what these places demand of you, in cost, in stress, in sacrifice, is no longer returned in opportunity, quality of life, or future. In Paris, that calculation has been failing for decades, but the scale has grown impossible to ignore. The city that gave the world the Enlightenment, the city whose very name became a synonym for civilization and beauty and intellectual life, counted just 2.1 million inhabitants in 2024. That number represents a population loss that has been ongoing for nearly 7 decades. 7 decades of quiet departure, dressed up each generation in a new set of reasons. First suburbanization, then economic stagnation, then the particular modern combination of suffocating housing costs, deteriorating public services, and what longtime residents describe simply as a city that has become very difficult to actually live in. The Eiffel Tower still stands, the Seine still flows. But the people who built their lives there are leaving, and behind the marketing. As anyone who has tried to rent an apartment in Paris recently can tell you, the cracks are not metaphorical, they are structural. London tells a version of the same story, only faster and louder. The United Kingdom recorded more than 500,000 departures in 2024 alone, with 215,000 of those being British citizens actively choosing to leave. For younger British people, the calculation has become almost mathematical in its clarity. 38% of Brits under 35 are considering leaving within the next 5 years, and 11% are actively planning their departure. The cost of living crisis is cited by 39% of prospective expats as a key driver, and those are not just abstract economic anxieties. London's housing market has produced a generation priced out of ownership, priced out of reasonable rental, and increasingly priced out of the city itself. What economic uncertainty, high inflation, and the aftermath of Brexit have combined to create is a systematic hollowing out of ambition from the city. High net worth individuals began leaving en masse following the cancellation of the non-dom tax regime. The talent that remains often does so by necessity rather than by choice. And when talent stays not because it wants to but because it has not yet found the exit, that is a city beginning to consume its own future. The pattern repeats in Berlin, though here it arrives dressed in different historical clothing, which makes it both more surprising and more instructive. Berlin was supposed to be the comeback story of the century. The city that rose from the literal rubble of the 20th century's worst disasters, that reunited, reinvented itself, became the capital of a reunified Germany, attracted artists and startups and international professionals, and made the case that a European city could still be young, affordable, and culturally alive into the 21st century. That story is not entirely false, but it is rapidly aging. Germany lost 91,000 people on net in 2024 alone to emigration, a figure that represents a structural hemorrhage of the very talent the country and its cities spent decades cultivating. Among STEM professionals in Germany, 44% say they are considering moving abroad. Among university students, more than 40% can imagine emigrating for career reasons, up from 27% just 2 years earlier. The destinations tell the story: Switzerland, Austria, the United States. Places offering what Germany no longer confidently provides: higher salaries, lower tax burdens. Germany's top effective personal tax rate sits near 47.9%. Switzerland's comparable burden lands around 22.9%. That is not an academic discrepancy. For the engineer or the software developer, or the young professional doing the arithmetic of their next decade, it is the difference between a life they can build and a life they are subsidizing for others. Berlin, for all its cultural residue, cannot insulate itself from that arithmetic indefinitely. The city that once attracted talent from across Europe because it was cheap, electric, and open, is now neither cheap nor particularly easy. Its population grew through the 2010s, then stabilized, and among those who remain, the conversation has changed in quality. The question is no longer, why would you ever leave Berlin? It is, with increasing frequency, have you thought about where else you might go? But if there is one city where the quiet exit reveals itself most nakedly, most instructively, it is Amsterdam. A city of extraordinary beauty, extraordinary historical significance, and today, extraordinary dysfunction. The Dutch housing crisis is now measured not in months, but in decades. As of early 2026, the Netherlands is approximately 410,000 homes short of what its population needs. That deficit represents nearly 5% of the national housing stock. In Amsterdam specifically, waiting lists for social housing run to 20 years. An average apartment in the city now runs to €2,300 to €2,500 per month for 80 square meters. An average house across the Netherlands costs close to €500,000, 10 times the average Dutch salary. And in 2025, only around 69,200 new homes were completed nationwide, far below the government's own target of 100,000 per year. Too many Amsterdammers, as the city's own researchers have noted, are being forced to leave because they simply cannot find a suitable home. The housing paradox takes a particular form in Amsterdam. There are an estimated 50,000 potential homes sitting empty above and behind shops on the city's busy streets, spaces long abandoned when storefronts were expanded and separate entrances removed. The capacity exists, the crisis persists. And the people who could build lives there, who came for the dynamism and the culture and the promise of the Dutch model, are quietly expanding their searches outward, to Almere, to Haarlem, to cities that are accessible but increasingly far from the place they came to inhabit. This is the pattern. Not one city in crisis, but a constellation of cities entering the same phase at slightly different speeds, for overlapping but distinct reasons. And the pattern has a historical name, even if those living through it prefer not to use it. Rome did not empty in a year. Constantinople did not lose its position overnight. The great Venetian Republic did not collapse in a single moment of catastrophe. They all passed through a period that historians later identified as the point at which the calculation reversed, when the costs of staying inside the empire exceeded the benefits, when the people with choices began, quietly, to exercise them. What is happening in Europe's biggest cities today is that calculation reversing in real time. And the question is not whether it is happening. The data establishes that clearly enough. The question is what it means for the cities left behind, and for the people still inside them who have not yet made their decision. Because here is what the official narrative misses, and what only becomes visible when you step back from the individual city stories and look at the pattern as a whole. The people leaving are not the ones who failed. They are not the disenchanted or the disillusioned or the people who could not make it work. They are, disproportionately, the people who made it work well enough to have options. The British citizens leaving London in their hundreds of thousands are not the unemployed. They are the skilled professionals cited by every major industry as critical losses. The Germans considering Switzerland and the United States are not the underqualified. They are STEM professionals, engineers, academics, the very stratum of talent that every advanced economy needs more of, not less. When the exit is concentrated among the capable, what remains is a city that changes composition, not overnight. Not dramatically enough to make the front pages or the policy briefings, but steadily, and the change is self-reinforcing in ways that are rarely acknowledged. When a neighborhood loses enough young professionals to housing costs, the restaurants they supported begin to close. When a city loses enough high-earning taxpayers, the public services those taxes funded begin to degrade. When the degradation reaches a certain threshold, more people leave. The cycle is familiar from history. Detroit understood it. Pittsburgh understood it. What is different about Paris, London, Berlin, and Amsterdam is that they were supposed to be immune. They were not supposed to be candidates for this conversation. That immunity was never structural. It was a story. And like all stories told about great cities in their golden ages, it sustained itself longest precisely because it was so convincing, and because admitting its limits felt like a kind of treason. But the great European escape is not an act of treason. It is a rational response to conditions that were created slowly, over decades, through a series of policy choices, market failures, and structural neglects that no single generation made and no single mayor can reverse. The housing crises in London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Berlin were not accidents. They were the predictable result of treating housing as an investment asset rather than a human necessity, of designing tax regimes that extracted more than they created, of allowing the gap between the city's promises and their delivered realities to widen year by year until it became impossible to ignore. There is also a geography to where the escaping go, and that geography is its own kind of verdict on the cities left behind. Southern Europe, for decades the source of outward migration toward the northern capitals, is now reversing the flow. Lisbon is emerging as a European hub for remote workers and young professionals who once would have defaulted to London or Berlin. Italians who left after the 2008 crisis are beginning to find, in some corners, reason to return, not necessarily to Rome or Milan, but to a different version of Italy. The British are choosing Spain and Portugal and France, not as the capitals of ambition they once were, but as places where a reasonable life can still be constructed without the punishing mathematics of a Tier 1 European city. This redistribution matters because it suggests that the exodus is not a European decline in any total sense. It is something more specific and more instructive. It is the decline of particular cities that made particular promises and failed to keep them. The promise of meritocracy that priced out the meritocrats. The promise of cultural richness that priced out the culture makers. The promise of opportunity that concentrated opportunity so narrowly that opportunity itself became the exit route. What history teaches us, when we look at the cities that have gone through this transition before, is that the moment of return, if it comes at all, requires not a campaign or a rebrand or an Olympic Games. It requires a fundamental reckoning with what the city is actually for, who it serves, what it asks in return. The cities that made that reckoning, and made it honestly, found ways through. The cities that did not, that continued to produce glossy projections and investment attraction campaigns, while their residents quietly calculated the cost of leaving, those cities did not find ways through. They found, instead, a long and unmistakable decline that everyone eventually agreed had been visible all along. Europe's greatest cities are at that moment of choice. Not the dramatic, cinematic moment of a wall falling or a stock market collapsing, but the slower, quieter, more consequential moment when enough people with enough options decide to leave. The question of what kind of cities they become in response to that departure will define European urban life for the rest of this century. If you found yourself nodding through any part of this, if you have felt what we have been describing in a city you live in, or a city you left, or a city you are still deciding about, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to keep this kind of investigation alive. The exit has been underway for decades. The data is now undeniable. What comes next depends entirely on whether the cities inside this pattern choose to see what is in front of them, or whether they continue, as empires tend to do in their late chapters, to mistake the echo of former greatness for the thing itself. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in patterns. And the pattern we have documented across Paris, London, Berlin, and Amsterdam is one that history has seen before, always in cities that believed they were the exception, always in the generation that could not quite bring itself to admit what the numbers were already saying. Tell us in the comments which European city you think follows this pattern next, and subscribe. The next chapter is already loading.